What happens when a Hollywood giant, a man whose name alone defines generations of cinema, steps into what he believes is a routine morning show interview, only to find himself cornered in the most intense, intellectual showdown of his life? Stay with this story, because what unfolded next didn't just disrupt live television, it rewrote the rules. You're about to witness how a harmless promotional appearance transformed into a raw, unfiltered confrontation. A moment so jarring it left viewers frozen, the studio rattled, and one of America's most respected actors walking off set with visible disdain. Before we go any further, make sure you're part of the Legion. Hit that subscribe button and head to the comments later to share your verdict, because what you're about to hear has become legend. The morning began under a veil of calm at the Good Morning America studios, tucked into the relentless pulse of Times Square. The atmosphere was deceptively peaceful. Clint Eastwood, the myth, the icon, the living legend, arrived to promote his latest directorial project. Industry insiders whispered that this stark Western wasn't just another film. It might be his final masterpiece, a full-circle return to the genre that built his legacy. But beneath the studio lights, tension simmered. Makeup artists moved with surgical precision. Producers glided across the floor like generals surveying a battlefield. And at the center of it all sat a small, ordinary table, one that would soon become ground zero. Across from Eastwood sat George Stephanopoulos, calm, composed, notes aligned with calculated intent. As the cameras went live, their red lights glowing like warning beacons, millions tuned in expecting warmth, nostalgia, and reverence. What they got instead was something no one anticipated. "Good morning, Clint. Thank you for being with us," Stephanopoulos began, his smile polished to broadcast perfection. "At 94 years young, you're still directing, still creating, still commanding the screen. What keeps that fire burning at this stage of your life?" Eastwood leaned back, unshaken, a monarch at ease on his throne. That legendary squint, carved by decades of sunlight and scrutiny, cut through the studio glare. His voice, gravelly and deliberate, carried the weight of a lifetime spent defining heroes and anti-heroes. "Well, George," he said calmly, "it comes down to loving the craft. Storytelling has always been my purpose. Once you find that, age stops mattering. Every day there's another vision, another scene, another story demanding to be told." Inspiring, but listen closely, Ksharin, because this was the calm before the storm. Stephanopoulos nodded, but something shifted. A subtle change in tone. A quiet recalibration. "Your new film, much like your classic westerns, explores justice and morality," he continued. "A man forced to choose between right and wrong. Do those themes resonate differently today than when you first burst onto the scene in the 1960s? Eastwood paused. Not a word. Not a movement. A statue in thought. Then, measured and firm. "A powerful story is timeless. The human heart understands right and wrong. It knows the moment a person must stand by their convictions, when they draw a line in the sand. That truth never changes. Human nature doesn't change." A compelling answer. But did you feel it? That faint tremor in the air? "Interesting perspective," Stephanopoulos replied, casually shuffling his notes. "To an untrained eye, nothing unusual. But to seasoned viewers, it was unmistakable. The signal of a hunter switching tactics. And speaking of standing by convictions," he pivoted, "you've been very open about your political views over the years. You've endorsed candidates, addressed conventions, and made statements that sparked national debate." Eastwood didn't flinch, but something hardened. A tightening around the eyes, a sharpened focus. His posture shifted, attention fully engaged. "I believe participating in democracy is essential," Eastwood responded evenly. "Every American has not just the right, but the responsibility to make their voice heard." But Stephanopoulos wasn't done. "And yet," he pressed, his tone now edged like steel. Your voice has often been controversial. The empty chair incident. Your criticism of political correctness. Your stances on divisive social issues. Do you ever question taking such firm positions, knowing they could alienate the very audiences who support your films? The question landed heavy. The studio fell still, the air thick with expectation. And right there, hanging between two men, two worldviews, and millions of watching eyes, was the moment everything could change. What happened next is where history was made. A faint tightening of Clint Eastwood's jaw was the only warning. But when he spoke again, his voice carried a colder edge, tempered steel instead of weathered wisdom. "George, I speak on what I believe needs to be said," he declared. "I don't lose sleep over who agrees or who doesn't. I've been in this industry for over 60 years, and one truth has never failed me. You will never please everyone. Art can't be created by committee, and life can't be lived while constantly fearing offense." Strong words, but the confrontation was far from over. Sensing a fracture, Stephanopoulos leaned in. "With influence like yours," he countered, "comes responsibility. When someone of your stature speaks, those words ripple outward. They shape perspectives. Don't you feel a moral obligation to exercise greater restraint?" The shift was unmistakable. Eastwood leaned forward, his gaze locking onto the host with predatory intensity. "Caution?" he repeated. "I've been cautious my entire life. Every role, every film, every public statement, chosen deliberately. But caution is not the same as silence. And it's certainly not an apology for holding convictions." You could feel it now. The air itself seemed heavier. Cameras rolled as crew members exchanged uneasy glances. In the control room, producers hovered over their monitors, watching a moment spiral out of control. This interview had officially abandoned the script. The polite promotional segment was gone. And rather than retreat, Stephanopoulos appeared emboldened, ready to push even harder. He glanced at his notes, not as a host anymore, but as a prosecutor preparing his case. "Let me be clear," he said, his tone sharp, almost judicial. "Over the years, you've made statements that many found alarming. Remarks about minorities, about women, about social progress itself. You've dismissed calls for equality as political correctness run amok. How does that reconcile with the heroes you portray? The men who defend the powerless and stand against injustice?" The transformation was immediate. The warm elder statesman vanished. In his place stood the unyielding figure audiences had seen, face-down enemies on screen for decades. Eastwood's expression hardened into granite. "George," he said curtly, "you're twisting my words, and I find that insinuation deeply offensive. My entire career has been dedicated to telling stories about people who do the right thing, who confront bullies, who protect those who can't protect themselves. My convictions are not separate from that legacy. They align with it." But Stephanopoulos struck back instantly. "Do they?" he challenged. "Because when you dismiss cries of systemic injustice as political correctness, aren't you effectively silencing real victims? Telling them their lived experiences don't matter? Isn't that the very behavior your on-screen heroes fight against?" The words landed like a punch to the chest. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Eastwood's jaw flexed, muscles working as he wrestled his fury into control. The nation watched, breath held. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, restrained, but rumbling with barely contained thunder. "Listen to me carefully," he growled. "Never, not once in my life, have I told another human being that their experience doesn't matter. I've worked with people from every background imaginable. I've told stories from every corner of the human condition. And I've always tried to treat everyone I meet with dignity and respect." A pause. Then the line that split the room. "But I will not apologize for believing we've reached a dangerous point, where good people are afraid to speak honestly." Stephanopoulos seized the opening. But doesn't speaking freely, he pressed, leaning forward, often come at the cost of someone else's pain? When you minimize movements like Me Too or Black Lives Matter, you're not just offering a differing opinion, you're diminishing real suffering. How is that any different from the villains in your films, the ones who ignore injustice for their own comfort? And that was the moment. Eastwood's hands clamped down on the arms of his chair. His knuckles turned white. The tension snapped tight, and everyone knew something irreversible was about to happen. That comparison, unthinkable, a direct strike at the very legacy Clint Eastwood had spent decades building, was the blow that shattered whatever fragile truce remained. "That's enough, George," Eastwood snapped. "You're inventing words and warping my entire life's work to fit a narrative you decided on before I ever sat down. I have never, ever made light of anyone's suffering." But Stephanopoulos sensed momentum, and he pressed forward without hesitation. "Haven't you?" he challenged. "When you ridicule safe spaces, dismiss trigger warnings, and criticize political correctness, aren't you effectively telling people who've been broken that their trauma is an inconvenience? That they should simply move on? Isn't that the very indifference your cinematic heroes would despise?" And with that, the composure cracked. Eastwood's restraint shattered like glass. "You're damn right. I think people need to toughen up," he fired back. "Life is hard, George. It always has been. You face adversity head on. You wrestle with it. You keep moving forward. You don't build monuments to victimhood and demand the world reshape itself around fragile sensibilities." The trap snapped shut. "So trauma victims are just wallowing?" Stephanopoulos pounced, his words echoing through the stunned studio. People who've survived sexual assault, racial violence, systemic oppression, their pain is just oversensitivity? Eastwood knew instantly he'd stepped onto dangerous ground, but instead of retreating, he doubled down, pushing every chip he had to the center of the table. "That is not what I said. And you know it," he shot back. "But yes, I believe there's a vast difference between acknowledging evil and turning every slight, every awkward interaction, every difficult conversation into a capital offense. There's a line between seeking justice and silencing anyone who dares to disagree." "And who decides where that line is?" Stephanopoulos countered, the question landing like checkmate. "You, other powerful, wealthy men who've never experienced real discrimination? Do you see the irony? Your entire career was built portraying men who stood up to that exact kind of dismissive authority." The studio fell into a vacuum. No chatter, no movement, just the hum of cameras and hushed whispers bleeding from the control room. Everyone present knew they were watching something unprecedented. The illusion of morning show civility had completely collapsed. Eastwood locked his eyes on Stephanopoulos, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles stood out like steel cables. The silence stretched. Thick, heavy, unbearable. The kind of pause that, in one of his westerns, would have preceded a gunfight at high noon. When he finally spoke, his voice dropped into something far more dangerous. Calm, controlled, and unmistakably final. "George, I've shown you extraordinary patience today. I came here to discuss my film, to share my work with your audience. Instead, you turned this into a political ambush, a public execution disguised as an interview. And to be perfectly clear, my patience has run out." But Stephanopoulos wasn't finished. Sensing weakness in the armor, he moved in with surgical precision. "I'm simply holding you accountable for your own words and actions. If seeing your reflection feels like an attack, perhaps the issue isn't the mirror. It's the image staring back at you." Forced to confront? Eastwood's voice rose for the first time, a low thunder rolling across the studio. The iconic growl, familiar to generations, surfaced at last. "No one forces me to do anything, George. Not in my past, not in my future." He leaned forward. "What you're doing isn't journalism. It's character assassination. You've cherry-picked decades of statements, twisted every position I've taken, and tried to paint me as some grotesque caricature for your audience. I've distorted nothing, Stephanopoulos replied coolly. I'm quoting you exactly. These are your beliefs, your words. If hearing them reflected back is uncomfortable, perhaps that says more about the beliefs themselves. Eastwood's squint narrowed into a laser-focused glare. You want to know what I believe, George? I believe this entire spectacle was orchestrated from the very beginning, Eastwood said, his voice steady but charged. I believe you never intended to talk about my film, my work, or anything meaningful I came here to share. I believe I was invited onto the stage for one reason: to be embarrassed, to be publicly dismantled for daring to stand outside the approved narrative. The accusation landed hard. A serious claim, Stephanopoulos fired back, the tension crackling between them. Yet for just a fraction of a second, a flicker crossed his face, a hint that the words had struck closer to the truth than he cared to admit. Are you suggesting that being asked to explain your own public record is somehow unfair? I'm saying that distorting that record, misrepresenting it, and weaponizing it against me absolutely is, Eastwood replied. And it goes beyond unfair. It's dishonest. It's the kind of dishonesty that's poisoning public discourse in this country. His voice strengthened, conviction building with every word. You want a lesson on bullying, George? This is what it looks like now. You use your platform, your authority, to publicly shame anyone who dares to think differently. Even Stephanopoulos' polished professionalism began to crack. I find it remarkable, he shot back, that a man with your wealth, your fame, your global influence is now portraying himself as a victim of bullying. You've had 6 decades to project your voice however you wanted. And now, when someone questions the consequences of that voice, you claim to be wronged. I never said I was a victim, Eastwood snapped, his tone now carrying the full weight of a man who had commanded sets, crews, and screens for generations. But I recognize fraudulent journalism when I see it, and I recognize a setup when I walk into one. Make no mistake, and that's exactly what this is. The pressure inside the studio became suffocating. Behind the scenes, producers silently debated cutting to commercial. Camera operators didn't dare look away. Everyone knew they were witnessing something raw, unscripted, irreversible. Stephanopoulos pushed forward, his tone stripped of any remaining restraint. Let me ask you this, Clint. Do you believe your dismissive attitudes towards social progress, your resistance to change, may have contributed to the very problems you now claim to care about? Has your influence in the end made things worse for the people you say you want to uplift? And that was it. In one explosive motion, Eastwood stood. His chair scraped violently across the studio floor, the sound slicing through the tension like a blade. That's enough, he said. I'm done with this charade. Clint, please, Stephanopoulos interjected, realization dawning too late. We still have several minutes left in the segment. No, George, we don't. Eastwood's voice was steel now, a cold, final, immovable. I came here in good faith. I came to discuss my craft, to offer something of value to your audience, but you've made your intentions clear. This was never a conversation. It was a political takedown. This is about accountability, Stephanopoulos insisted, a defensive parry. An honest examination of the impact of your public persona. As he spoke, Eastwood calmly reached up and removed his microphone. Deliberate, ceremonial, controlled fury in every movement. Honest, Eastwood replied. There has been nothing honest about this since the cameras went live. You had your script written before I ever sat down. No answer I gave was going to change your conclusion. So you're just walking away? Stephanopoulos pressed. Is that how you handle scrutiny? By leaving the stage? Eastwood paused, his hand stilling. He turned slowly and fixed the host with that unmistakable stare. the one audiences had seen precede, reckoning after reckoning. "George," he said quietly, "I've faced hard questions my entire life. I've navigated dangerous situations. I've dealt with difficult men and impossible choices." The pause that followed was electric, and everyone knew what came next would seal this moment into television history. "But what I will not do," Eastwood continued, his voice unwavering, "is waste a single breath engaging with people who act in bad faith. I won't participate in a game where you're invited in with a handshake, only to have your arm twisted behind your back." The word hung in the air like smoke. Bad faith. Stephanopoulos' voice rose, his polished composure finally cracking under the strain. "You are one of the most powerful public figures in America. You've made provocative statements for years. Questioning those statements isn't bad faith, it's journalism." "No, George," Eastwood replied firmly. He fully detached the microphone and stood to his full height. Suddenly, the visual itself told a story. A towering figure looming over the desk, a living monument facing a seated host. "Journalism," Eastwood said, "means asking fair questions and then having the integrity to actually listen to the answers. Journalism seeks understanding. It builds bridges. What happened here today was not journalism." He gestured lightly, but the impact was seismic. "This was a partisan ambush dressed up as a morning news segment, and I will not lend it another second of legitimacy." Silence swallowed the studio. No applause, no murmurs, just the low electrical hum of cameras still rolling. Every person in that room understood they were witnessing something that would be replayed, debated, and dissected for years. "But the real tragedy," Eastwood went on, his voice now heavy with disappointment rather than anger, "is this the characters I've portrayed, the stories I've told for decades? They're about men who stand against exactly this kind of corruption. Men who refuse to be railroaded, who won't be silenced, who don't surrender an inch when they're standing on principle." He paused. "And that," he said quietly, "is exactly who I'm being right now." With that final, unassailable declaration, Clint Eastwood turned and walked off the Good Morning America set. George Stephanopoulos remained seated at the center of the storm, stunned, motionless, alone. The cameras kept rolling, capturing the empty space where a legend had just stood. The silence was deafening. Until at last the control room cut the feed, and just like that, live television history was made. A Hollywood titan didn't just leave an interview, he delivered a lesson. A reminder, a warning, because some figures aren't meant to be cornered. If you want more stories of defiance, power, and moments that change the narrative forever, subscribe to the channel and drop your verdict in the comments below.